Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar organized by the team of registered dietitians at Dairy Farmers of Canada in partnership with Osteoporosis Canada. Today's webinar is entitled Protein for Bone Health, Evidence Update and Implications for Practice. And we are delighted to have so many of you participating today from across the country. Pour les personnes qui parlent français, notez que la présentation est offerte en traduction simultanée. Mais si vous souhaitez l'écouter dans la version originale, veuillez simplement cliquer sur l'option langue anglaise en haut de la page. My name is Isabelle Niederer, and I'm the Director of Nutrition and Research at Dairy Farmers of Canada. And it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our moderator, Carrie Grady. Carrie is a registered dietitian and the Senior Manager of Scientific and Clinical Programs at Osteoporosis Canada. Her role includes liaising with Osteoporosis Canada's Scientific Advisory Council, which is made up of more than 70 top-level bone health experts from across the country. And I'll turn it over to Carrie right away.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks to Dairy Farmers of Canada for providing this timely webinar and to Isabelle for the kind introduction. Osteoporosis Canada is the only national organization serving people who have or are at risk for osteoporosis. The organization works to educate, empower, and support individuals and communities in the risk reduction and treatment of osteoporosis. At Osteoporosis Canada, we educate Canadians about bone health, including healthcare professionals and their clients. We are excited about today's presentation as we recognize the importance of protein for musculoskeletal health and in the prevention of osteoporosis. In addition to calcium and other minerals, bone is made up of protein, a nutrient that is necessary for building and repairing body tissue, including bone. Protein gives bone its strength and flexibility. Protein is also the big component of muscles, which are critical for mobility and fall prevention. Presently, our Scientific Advisory Council, made up of nearly 80 bone health specialists from across Canada, are updating our clinical practice guidelines using the GRADE approach and will include nutrition recommendations. If you would like more information about osteoporosis, please visit our website at osteoporosis.ca. Before we get to the webinar, we have a bit of housekeeping. Our next 60 minutes together will include a presentation by Dr. Josse, our speaker, followed by a question period, time permitting. Throughout the presentation, you can submit questions using the chat box on your screen. We will try to address as many questions as possible. Before leaving the webinar, if you're interested, you can download the presentation by simply clicking on the link at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Josse received her doctoral degree in exercise physiology and nutrition from the Department of Kinesiology at McMaster University. She then completed a CIHR and Canadian Diabetes Association funded postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Toronto. She is currently an assistant professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Science at York University in Toronto and an affiliate scientist at St. Michael's Hospital. As a nutritional scientist and applied physiologist, her general research area combines clinical nutrition and exercise physiology. She is particularly interested in assessing the consumption of protein-rich whole foods with different modes of exercise in both acute and chronic contexts to facilitate healthy changes in body composition, body weight, bone, and cardiometabolic risk in different human populations across the lifespan, including those with obesity and increased chronic disease risk. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Josse.
Thank you, Isabelle and Carrie, for that introduction. And I'm delighted to be here today to discuss the topics of protein for bone health. Thank you to Dairy Farmers of Canada and to Osteoporosis Canada for highlighting this important topic and for putting this webinar together. Here are my relevant research supports and disclosures. This is what I will present today. I will start the webinar with a discussion of bone health across the lifespan and the nutrients that are of key importance to our bones. Then I will discuss many topics relating to protein, including our guidelines for consumption and requirements, how Canadians are doing with respect to meeting these guidelines, and other factors to consider, including protein quality when choosing the right protein source to consume for our bones. Lastly, I will highlight some of the more recent research in the area of bone health in both younger and older people. So what is bone? Bone is a dynamic and living tissue. It is made up of roughly 50% mineral and 50% protein by volume. When young, our bones undergo modeling, which is the process of pediatric bone accrual that begins in utero until the end of skeletal growth. And when we've stopped growing, bone continues to undergo a process called remodeling, characterized by what we know of as bone turnover. This is the constant breaking down of bone and the rebuilding of it. Peak bone mass is achieved at the end of skeletal growth phase, and there are several factors that we should consider in order to maximize peak bone mass. In any case, this time of skeletal growth leading up to peak bone mass is our window of opportunity. We should be focused on doing what we can during this time to maximize bone accrual to achieve the greatest peak. So with respect to bone health across the lifespan, we are generally concerned with two main factors. One, maximizing the achievement of peak bone mass when young, as I already mentioned. And two, on the other side of the lifespan curve, preventing bone loss as we age. Here's a figure of the bone remodeling cycle. Our bones are in a constant state of turnover. The main bone cells involved with this process are the osteoblasts and osteoclasts. The cycle starts with osteoclast resorption and is followed by osteoblast formation. Formation requires raw materials, for example, nutrients that we get from our diet. The idea is that if we do not provide the body with the right building blocks for bone, formation is compromised, leading to a loss of bone mass and strength over time. This slide eloquently depicts our bone mass changes across the lifespan. The point to emphasize from this figure are highlighted by Dr. Weaver and colleagues in the recent 2016 position stand from the National Osteoporosis Foundation on factors that affect peak bone mass development. Our lifestyle practices, in particular diet and exercise, particularly when we're young, do affect the development of peak bone mass. You can see here that peak bone mass occurs around our late teens, when the bone growth phase ceases. Following this, we have a maintenance phase from about 20 to 40 years old, and then the bone loss phase from about 40 onwards. However, Osteoporosis Canada asserts that bone loss actually begins even earlier than this, at around 30 years old. Anyway, in the first phase of growth, this is the period of more rapid accretion and a time of both opportunity and vulnerability for optimizing peak bone mass. If one adopts a suboptimal lifestyle during this time that is not beneficial for bone, and this can include not consuming adequate nutrition and or not exercising or stressing the bone appropriately, peak bone mass will likely not be achieved or optimized, leading to a lower peak. Ultimately then, over time, bone loss occurs, and this will lead to an increased risk for osteoporosis and fracture sooner than those with higher initial peaks. You can see this on the right side of the figure. The usual trajectories with an optimal peak, but the reaching of the danger zone sooner with a suboptimal peak. So given the importance of achieving an optimal peak bone mass when young to the trajectory of the disease progression later in life, Osteoporosis Canada has fittingly defined osteoporosis as a pediatric disease with geriatric consequences. Based on the previous figure, you can see why. As discussed in the NOF position stand, in youth, the focus should be on optimal peak bone mass development. Several nutrients are important for bone, including calcium, vitamin D, protein, and other micronutrients. Some of these were assessed in the position stand, along with other lifestyle factors that we will not discuss today. A grading scheme based on the strength of the evidence regarding peak bone mass development was implemented, and the figure on the right of the slide shows the factors and their grades. Calcium received a grade of A, vitamin D and dairy products received grades of B, and protein received a grade of C. I should point out that the grade of C here is not necessarily because protein is not important for bone, but that the level of high quality evidence for this relationship is lacking and more studies are needed. With respect to adults, again, on this graph, looking at the right side of the lifespan trajectory curve, as we age, we experience a slow and insidious bone loss over time, which can lead to a diagnosis of osteoporosis. Women do have a steeper downward curve for bone loss beyond menopause, contributing to their higher prevalence of the disease. And I've added some relevant statistics regarding the incidence and prevalence of osteoporosis and related fractures in Canada to this slide. The statistics are of clear and important concern. The bottom right picture shows a healthy versus osteoporotic proximal femur bone, the latter being more porous and more susceptible to fracture. In adults, while the focus is slightly different in that we are focused on minimizing the loss of bone mass with increased age, we are still concerned with consuming the same bone-supporting nutrients as listed here. There are a few subtle differences and nuances with respect to recommendations for the older adults, which we will discuss in subsequent slides, including protein source and total energy intake. For the next few slides, I will go over these nutrients in a bit more detail. Calcium, receiving a grade of A in the NOF position stand, is a crucial mineral for bone health. In terms of the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance, which is set at a level that would meet the needs of 98% of the healthy population, for calcium, it is highest for youth, lowest in young adulthood, and then higher again in older adulthood. This follows the trajectory of skeletal changes that occur across the lifespan and the important needs for this mineral at various stages of growth, maintenance, and loss. Osteoporosis Canada has slightly different recommendations for calcium in that they recommend that all adults over 50 consume 1,200 milligrams per day, not just females. Here's a table of calcium-containing foods, along with the amounts of calcium they contain and the servings of that food. Dairy products and some animal foods contain higher amounts of calcium compared to plant foods. You can see that it is possible to get calcium from sources other than dairy, but in some cases you get far less for a given amount of food. For example, in terms of energy, looking at almonds, and for those that know me know that I love almonds, as shown here, to get 300 milligrams of calcium from almonds, you would need to eat roughly 1 cup of almonds, which equates to around 650 calories, which is a lot of calories. In another example, looking at volume, 1 cup of spinach, while low in calories, only contains 30 milligrams of calcium. Therefore, one would have to consume 10 cups of raw spinach to get roughly the same amount of calcium as a cup of milk. Now, spinach, when cooked, does shrink down a lot, and it may be possible to consume that much at one time, but it's unlikely. And remember, to achieve the RDA, you would need to eat at least 3 times that per day. Also, the bioavailability of calcium from spinach is lower due to the presence of antinutrients that may impede its absorption. So in fact, you may even be getting less. So while it may be possible with planning to achieve adequate calcium intakes from the diet without dairy foods, it's arguably easier and potentially more practical to meet requirements from foods when milk and milk products are consumed. It's also important to note that while fortified beverages do contain a similar amount of calcium compared to milk on the label, they use supplemental calcium sources that may not be as bioavailable as natural calcium from dairy sources. And not all plant-based beverages are fortified with calcium. So if you are consuming one of these beverages or recommending them to others, please check the calcium and protein content. Vitamin D is important for the absorption of calcium. It upregulates the production of calcium transporters in the gut, which allows for more dietary absorption of calcium. We can get it from the sun and from our diet, but there are few dietary sources, and some of them I've shown here on the slide. The RDA for vitamin D is slightly higher for older adults than younger adults and youth. OC also has slightly different recommendations for vitamin D, providing greater levels of appropriate intakes. Like for calcium, OC's vitamin D recommendations represent more therapeutic targets for those at risk for osteoporosis. and this is why their recommendations are slightly higher for adults. In the blood, we can measure vitamin D status by assessing 25-hydroxy-D levels, and I've listed some cutoff levels here, but these also do vary slightly depending on the agency. People at increased risk for vitamin D deficiency include those with low sun exposure, more skin pigment, vegetarians and vegans, those that wear full coverage clothing, and breastfed infants. OC also recommends that all Canadian adults take a vitamin D supplement, specifically vitamin D3 or cholecalciferol year-round. As mentioned before, bone is partially comprised of protein. Therefore, protein is of importance for bone, and we will certainly discuss this in more detail in other parts of the webinar. Dairy products are high in protein and contain a significant amount of calcium per serving. Dairy foods also contain many other important micronutrients, making them nutrient-dense foods that are important for our bones. Health Canada has made fortification of milk and also margarine with vitamin D mandatory, and possibly also yogurt in the near future. Here's a table of protein-containing foods, like the one I made for calcium-containing foods. We will talk in more detail in the next section specifically about protein, but I just wanted to show you this table to get an idea of the amount of protein contained within certain foods. Animal foods contain more protein than plant foods, but plant foods do contain protein. You just need to eat more of them to ingest the same amount or consider using a plant-based protein supplement. An important point to note here, and this may be of particular importance to those who counsel older adults, we should consider the energy content of food we suggest these individuals to eat. This point was also made in relation to calcium. Older adults generally consume less food, so they need to achieve their nutrient quotas with less volume or less calories than younger people. And supplementation may be of greater importance to older adults. But choosing nutrient-dense foods whenever possible is an important nutritional strategy for older adults. There are also several nutrients or food components that may be of concern for our bone health that are listed here, including salt, alcohol, caffeine, and soda. But these are actually nutrients or foods to consider limiting anyway. We should also be aware of consuming foods high in anti-nutrients. This is because they are associated with decreased calcium absorption and also increased nutrient excretion and decreased nutrient bioavailability. So in summary, to keep our bones strong, we should eat a variety of foods that contain higher levels of the bone-supporting nutrients. This advice is the same for both younger and older populations. But there may be some different considerations for older adults, including overall energy content and volume of the meals and foods, making nutrient density a more important concept for them. Use the food label, for example, to assess protein, calcium, sodium, fiber, and other nutrients that are in a food that are good, but also maybe not so good for bone. And consumption should be mitigated for foods of concern for our bones, including salt, alcohol, and soda. And foods with increased anti-nutrient content should be noted, especially if these represent the primary sources of calcium and protein in the diet. So I'm going to switch gears now and discuss many things relating to protein. So in early 2019, Canada unveiled a new food guide. You can see the snapshot of it below on the slide. It is quite different in many ways from the previous food guide, and I'm sure most of you are already quite familiar with it. 1/4 of the plate is protein foods, although we can get protein from many other foods on the plate. Our food guide represents our food-based dietary guidelines, because after all, we eat food and not just nutrients. The guidelines in this new food guide, compared to previous guides, are more flexible, more adaptable to taste and food preferences, arguably simpler, and they offer more general advice to healthy eating. They are also not prescriptive. They also support many different eating patterns consistent with a healthy diet, including those that are plant-based. I've put the US MyPlate on this slide beside our food guide. It is quite similar in many respects, especially in the portions of food to eat. A main difference is that Canada's food guide does not show milk as the drink of choice. It shows water instead. I certainly support drinking water, but with milk not depicted in the food guide snapshot and most dairy foods left off, certainly in comparison to the old food guide, the utility of dairy foods in our diet is potentially open to public confusion and misinterpretation. That is, people presume that dairy foods are not important nutritional conduits. And I would argue that based on the evidence they are, particularly for our bones because of the nutrients they provide. I should mention that in supporting documentation for the food guide, dairy products are mentioned and consumption of them is encouraged, but this is not evident or obvious on the snapshot and likely also not to the public. In fact, a very recent review on this topic written by leading Canadian nutrition and protein experts was published in AP&M, and I provide the reference at the bottom of this slide. It detailed recommendations for how best to showcase high-quality protein foods, both animal and plant, in the new food guide, and it identified knowledge gaps and the ways to move forward with improving key messages from it about protein foods. Dairy foods were also mentioned, not only in terms of their nutrient and protein content, but also regarding future messaging and communications on their utility in the diet. Again, and in particular relation to bone health, Osteoporosis Canada states on their website that Canadians need adequate amounts of calcium, vitamin D, and protein for optimal bone health. Milk products containing a higher proportion of calcium per serving and are great sources of protein. These messages are important to disseminate as the bone-supporting nutrients are generally those of concern and are listed as our shortfall nutrients. Indeed, without the proper depiction of dairy foods in the food guide snapshot, if one ate like this, it would be difficult to achieve some of our nutrient recommendations. And this was examined by Dr. Susan Barr at UBC. She published a paper also in AP&M about the nutritional adequacy of the food guide snapshot, and I just wanted to highlight some of her main findings. The figure on the right of the slide shows the nutrient amounts per 2,000 calories of the snapshot foods expressed as a percentage of the daily values for most individuals. As you can see, most nutrients were provided in amounts that met or exceeded the daily value, suggesting that the snapshot depicts a dietary pattern that would meet or exceed requirements for these nutrients. And for the nutrients to limit, like saturated fat, cholesterol, sugar, and sodium, these were below their DVs, so that's good. However, calcium and vitamin D were shown to be at 50% and 42% of their DVs. And as already mentioned, these are nutrients of concern for Canadians. So while the snapshot is just that, it's a snapshot, it's a guide, that is, people do not eat just these foods every day. If they did, theoretically, they would not be consuming enough of important shortfall nutrients, calcium and vitamin D, and this is a problem. So moving away from the food guide to the dietary reference intakes are nutrient-based dietary recommendations. I will be focusing on protein here. The RDA for protein, determined by nitrogen balance studies a while ago, represents the estimate of the minimum daily average intake to meet the needs of 98% of healthy people to prevent disease, not the amount needed to achieve optimal health. In any case, there has been a lot of discussion about the adequacy of the current protein RDA for adults, which is 0.8 grams per kilo per day. And more recent research has shown it to be underestimated, particularly in certain populations like the elderly. Levels closer to 1.2 or 1.6 have been shown to be beneficial. The AMDR, or acceptable macronutrient distribution range for protein, is another of the DRI recommendations. It is very large at 10 to 35% and encompasses protein consumption levels associated with a wide range of dietary patterns. Most Canadians actually consume protein towards the lower end of the AMDR at around 16%. I have done a simple calculation on the slide showing that for a 60 kilogram adult female consuming a 2,000 calorie diet, the level of protein that is acceptable for this person ranges from 50 grams, which is essentially the RDA, all the way to 175 grams, corresponding to nearly 3 grams per kilo per day. Therefore, a wide range of protein intakes are acceptable within our guidelines, despite the lower RDAs, which again, were designed as the minimum average intake level to prevent disease. So I don't want to get into this too much, but I did want to show that there has been a tremendous amount of research in the area of protein requirements. New studies using the indicator amino acid oxidation method, a stable isotope tracer method, and different statistical analyses has produced new protein requirements across all age groups that are much higher than the current RDA. We can see that here on the slide. For a group of older females, protein requirements were estimated to be around 1.3 grams per kilo per day. For active males, it was around 1.4 grams per kilo per day, and for youth, it was around 1.55. And if you'd like more information about these techniques, please see the references that I've provided. So perhaps it's time to revise the low protein RDA. The ProTage group, which is an international study group brought together recently to review dietary protein needs, particularly for older adults, has provided their recommendations to indicate that the protein RDA should be higher at a level of around 1 to 1.5 grams per kilo per day. And protein consumption should be around 25 to 30 grams per meal. And this corresponds to achieving a certain level of leucine per meal. Leucine is an essential amino acid that has a particularly important role in turning on protein synthesis. Older adults do require more protein for many reasons, including to support good health, promote recovery from illness, and maintain functionality. And this also applies to bone. So according to our national nutrition surveys, are Canadians eating enough protein? The top left figure shows that in 2015, the Canadian Community Health Survey data for protein. The red box represents the AMDR. We can see here that protein consumption as a percentage of total calories for all ages and sex groups is within the AMDR. But this does not necessarily translate to everyone consuming an adequate level of protein. For older adults, their energy intakes are also reduced, so their absolute level of protein intake would be reduced too. But this is not necessarily reflected in their relative consumption. Additionally, and specific to dairy, in the blue figure, the 2004 CCHS demonstrates that people across all age groups do not consume enough dairy products, particularly adolescent females and older adults. The table on the bottom of the slide is from the 2015 CCHS and shows again that adults are still below the dairy recommendations. This is important because dairy products are nutrient-dense protein foods that are important for bones, as I already discussed. This is another recent study that specifically assessed trends for food and beverage intakes in Canada by comparing 2015 data to 2004 data from the CCHS. You can see some of the main changes in protein foods. Compared to 2004, Canadians consume more plant-based protein foods, which is good and in line with the current dietary recommendations. But again, less fluid milk consumption, and when examining the trends in calcium consumption over time from the CCHS, we also see a reduction in calcium intakes from foods. So at a population level, we are seeing that a lower consumption of milk and dairy products does not seem to affect protein intakes drastically. That is, Canadians are still consuming an adequate amount of protein that has not really changed that much over time. They're just getting more of it from other non-dairy sources. However, it is apparent that the reduction in dairy products in the diet is negatively affecting our calcium intakes, and this is of concern at all ages. Also of concern is that this trend may now be compounded by the fact that milk is no longer as present in the food guide as it was before. Now, it does appear that Canadians have increased their non-fluid dairy consumption, mostly as yogurt. As you can see in this figure, which also does contribute to calcium intake. But the increase in non-fluid dairy is not sufficient enough to offset the reduction in milk or calcium. So for the next two slides, I would like to discuss a bit about protein quality. While the new food guide contains a grouping specifically for protein foods, we actually get protein in varying amounts from all of the food groupings, but not all proteins are created equal. That is, their quality is different. And this primarily relates to the level of essential amino acids that they contain, as well as other food matrix properties. There are 20 amino acids, as you can see in this table. 9 of them on the right side are considered essential. These are the ones that our body cannot synthesize, so we need to obtain them from our diet. The figure on the right depicts the essential amino acid levels of certain plant and animal protein foods. I have decided to show you total essential amino acids and methionine and lysine, as these two are considered main limiting amino acids. You can see as a percentage of the total amino acids in the food, most plant proteins, shown with the white bars, are deficient in important essential amino acids compared to animal proteins shown in the gray bars. That is, their levels are below the other horizontal line, indicating their requirement threshold. This makes some plant proteins less efficiently used by the body to create new proteins, and thus making them of lower quality. So again, protein quality is determined by the ability for the body to use the protein to synthesize new proteins, that is, the protein's anabolic potential. Protein quality is based in part on the essential amino acid content, specifically taking into account limiting essential amino acids, but also on the digestibility of the food, which has more to do with the food matrix and other nutrients it contains. Protein quality is measured or rated in several ways. Here we see a table of PDCAS, or protein digestibility corrected amino acid scores, and DIAS, digestible indispensable amino acid scores. These rating systems consider the individual essential amino acid amounts, and in particular, the most limiting essential amino acid, as well as the digestibility of the food. You can see the quality rankings of several protein foods and isolates in this table. Animal proteins are generally ranked higher than plant proteins, and soy protein isolate is also higher. Plant proteins are generally of lower quality because, as we saw on the previous slide, they naturally contain lower levels of these essential amino acids, or that the amino acids present are not as easily absorbed. This is mostly due to the presence of antinutrients within the plant foods, like phytates and oxalates. These factors can trap and inhibit the absorption of essential amino acids and other nutrients within the food. To overcome the lower quality of some plant proteins, one can eat more of the food, or one can combine 2 plant protein foods together that are deficient in 2 different essential amino acids. This is called protein complementation, and the classic example is rice and beans, as I've shown here. We often do eat mixed meals anyway, so we combine various proteins all the time, more than we think. Anyway, it is no coincidence that rice and beans evolved to be a staple dish in many countries around the world where animal proteins were not as readily consumed. Rice is a grain that's deficient in lysine, and beans are legumes that are deficient in methionine and cysteine. And together, they are a more complete protein. So, is more protein beneficial for the musculoskeletal system? As mentioned before, there seems to be a consensus view that yes, more than the RDA is beneficial. Most of the definitive research in this area takes on a muscle-centric lens, perhaps because it's easier to measure the direct effects of protein on muscle. It is much harder to measure or quantify its direct effect on bone. Nonetheless, the concrete recommendations for more protein as they relate to muscle and functional capacity with age, I would argue also apply to bone. Bones also require protein and undergo a dynamic process of turnover, and it also degrades with age, like muscle. In terms of the purported negative effects of higher protein on the body in healthy individuals, higher protein intakes do not adversely affect kidney function, and I've cited a recent meta-analysis that shows this here. However, if you do have chronic kidney disease, the National Kidney Foundation recommends a reduced protein intake, and I've added the link to these guidelines here. The other cited issue with higher protein intakes, especially higher animal protein intakes, is that they produce greater acid loads in the body. This purportedly leaches minerals like calcium from the bones to neutralize the acid, thereby weakening bones over time. This is called the acid ash hypothesis. And this is not the case, and I go into this in more detail on the next slide. The alarming finding with the acid ash hypothesis was that higher protein diets, predominantly of animal origin, led to increased urinary calcium excretion, and it was originally thought that calcium was coming from our bones. But a series of intricate stable isotope tracer studies debunked this hypothesis. Essentially, Dr. Kerstetter and her team repeatedly demonstrated, although I only highlight one of her studies here from 2005, that higher protein diets also increase intestinal absorption of calcium, which parallels the increased urinary calcium excretion. That is, they showed that the extra calcium excreted is essentially not coming from our bones. The figure on the slide shows urinary calcium excretion on the top and the percentage of calcium absorbed in the intestine on the bottom. And you can see clearly that as protein intake increases up to 2.1 grams per kilo per day, more calcium is absorbed and excreted. And this was shown within the same people, as this was a crossover study. In the CAMEL study, a large prospective longitudinal cohort study of osteoporosis conducted in Canada, no associations were found between urinary acid excretion or urinary pH and measures of BMD and fracture risk after a follow-up of 5 and 7 years. And in this study, there was a good range of protein intakes and from different dietary sources too. So with respect to the protein section of this webinar, in summary, the new Canada's Food Guide is based on a healthy dietary pattern. It contains a protein food grouping with less of an emphasis on dairy foods in the snapshot. Dairy foods are important foods to consume, particularly for our bones, and are mentioned as such in the supporting materials for Canada's Food Guide and on the OC and DFC websites. It is important to mitigate confusion and misinterpretation of the snapshot regarding the utility of dairy in the diet and for our bones. The current protein RDA may be underestimated. Using the IAAO method, protein intakes greater than the RDA at around 1.2 grams per kilo per day or even higher are beneficial for adults. Protein quality is important to consider in diet planning. Animal is higher than plant, and this may be particularly important for older adults when choosing what proteins to consume, as they tend to eat less calories. And lastly, higher dietary protein is not adverse in healthy people. It is safe. And while it can increase urinary calcium excretion, it does not lead to poor bone health because of calcium mobilization. For the remainder of this webinar, I will share with you some relevant research in the area of protein and bone across the lifespan. Recall that the NOF gave protein for bone health a grade of C for evidence in the youth age group, but this really had more to do with the fact that there are very few RCTs done assessing protein and bone endpoints in youth. I'd like to share with you some of my group and collaborators' recent work in this area. I've generally stayed to the left of the lifespan curve and have carried out studies assessing differential intakes of protein and dairy foods in adolescents and young adults in combination with exercise, which is also a benefit for our bone. The first two studies were done in females with overweight and obesity, and the last one was done in young normal weight males. And of course, their bones matter too. My group recently published an RCT carried out in adolescent females aged 12 to 16 years old with overweight and obesity. And we asked the question, does increased dairy and protein intake improve bone health during a weight management intervention, combining healthy eating and exercise training? To answer this question, we conducted a 12-week intervention study with two groups, one group consuming 4 servings of mixed dairy products per day, and the other group maintained their habitually low dairy intakes at around 1 serving per day. Recall that 3 to 4 servings per day represented the dairy serving recommendation for this age group from the previous food guide, for which this study was modeled on. They also exercised at our university with a trainer 3 times a week. They consumed a eucaloric diet based on their energy requirements under the guidance of a dietitian. This was not a weight loss intervention, but it was one for weight management. At the beginning and the end of the study, we measured bone turnover markers in the blood. In terms of protein intake, our results showed that the group consuming dairy products significantly increased their protein intakes more than the other group and were consuming protein at around 1.1 grams per kilo per day, although by the end of the study, both groups were consuming protein above the RDA. With respect to calcium, the group consuming dairy products almost achieved their RDA for calcium by week 12, whereas the other group did not. In terms of bone health, we saw no changes in markers of bone formation like P1NP in either group, likely because they were already high in this growing age group and did not show, I did not show these particular data here for P1NP. But we did see a significant reduction in the bone resorption marker CTX, indicating a favorable bone response in these girls consuming dairy. Here's another study that we did, published in 2012, in young adult females with overweight and obesity. It was similar to the one in adolescents. In fact, the adolescent study I just presented was modeled off of this one. Here we asked, does the combination of higher dietary protein, higher dairy, exercise, and energy restriction promote bone health while achieving higher quality weight loss, which we defined as the loss of fat mass and the preservation of lean mass? This study was a 16-week weight loss RCT. There were 3 participant groups that differed in the amount and type of protein consumed. The control group had 15% of their energy as protein with no dairy. The dairy pro group had the same amount of protein as the control plus 3 servings of mixed dairy products. And the high dairy protein group had double the protein at 30% and double the dairy from the dairy protein group. So you can see the graded increase in dairy and protein with these 3 groups. They all exercised 5 days per week and met with a dietitian regularly for nutritional counseling. Here are the results from this study. Because of the graded increase in dairy and protein intakes, you can see how this is reflected in these nutrients. Those consuming higher levels of dairy products also had greater intakes of protein, calcium, and vitamin D. In terms of bone markers, we measured many different ones in this study to get a good idea of what was going on. In the bottom left table, we see that the control group had an increase in bone resorption with weight loss and exercise, whereas the high dairy protein group had an increase in bone formation and no change in resorption. This is also reflected in the figure on the right of the slide, where P1NP showed a graded increase with increased dairy and protein, and CTX showed a significant increase only in the group not consuming dairy. In terms of the calcitropic hormone, PTH, this followed a similar pattern in that for those consuming adequate calcium, that is the 2 groups with dairy, PTH significantly decreased, whereas it significantly increased in the control group. The last study from my group that I will present was a 12-week intervention where 30 young healthy males undertook a high-impact, high-load resistance exercise program. Half of them consumed 3 servings of Greek yogurt per day, and the other half consumed a maltodextrin pudding 3 times per day that was matched for energy, but did not contain protein or calcium. The nutrient intake story is the same here. With the consumption of Greek yogurt, we see increases in most of the important bone-supporting nutrients. Protein increased to 1.74 grams per kilo per day in the Greek yogurt group. Interestingly, both groups at baseline were habitually consuming above the RDA for protein at around 1.25 grams per kilo per day. And this is not what we tend to see or what we saw in our young females in the previous study, but I guess it's more par for the course for younger males to consume higher levels of protein. In terms of the bone turnover response, The graph to the right shows P1NP increased significantly only in the group consuming Greek yogurt with no changes in CTX. So based on these three studies, all carried out in the earlier stages of the lifespan, that is to the left and top of the curve, as I have circled in red, dairy plus protein plus exercise improved bone health assessed with bone turnover markers in adolescents and young adult populations. Interestingly, depending on the phase of the bone continuum, our interventions improve bone turnover in different ways. That is, adolescent females responded by decreasing resorption with no change in formation, again, likely because formation was already high and they were still in their growth phase. Whereas adult males and females responded similarly with increases in formation and no change in resorption. Either way, all of these responses led to beneficial changes in bone turnover with increased dairy protein and exercise. We also demonstrate in all three studies that it is easier to achieve the recommended nutrient intakes of calcium and protein with the consumption of milk products. In terms of research in adults and older adult populations, a recent comprehensive expert consensus review paper was published by Dr. Rizzoli and colleagues in 2018, examining the evidence regarding the benefits and safety of protein for bone health. They concluded that protein intakes above the RDA may be beneficial for bone. The review had several main findings, including that hip fracture risk is modestly decreased with higher dietary protein intakes, provided calcium intakes are adequate. Also, BMD appeared to be positively associated with dietary protein intakes. Protein and calcium combined in dairy products have beneficial effects on calcitropic hormones, bone turnover markers, and BMD. And again, this seems to require adequate calcium intakes. There appears to be no direct evidence of osteoporosis progression, fragility fracture, or altered bone strength with the acid load from a balanced diet origin. So for the next few slides, I would just like to highlight some other relevant studies in predominantly older adult populations. This slide highlights data from the cross-sectional analysis of the CAMOS study, the Canadian Multicenter Osteoporosis Study. I presented a bit from this study earlier, but to refresh, this was a prospective cohort study with data collected from over 6,000 adults in the mid to late 90s. Protein intakes were assessed via FFQ. Here you can see the cross-sectional BMD levels for the hip and lumbar spine. Dairy protein in the light gray bars was associated with higher total hip BMD for men and women 50 years and older, and lumbar spine BMD in men 50 years and older. Plant protein in the dark gray bars was associated with lower lumbar spine BMD for women 50 years and older, and I've noted these associations with red boxes. Not shown here, but in terms of fracture risk, in those older than 50 years old, lower total protein intakes of less than 12% of energy were associated with a significant increased risk of fragility fracture. That is, fracture outcomes were worse with lower protein intakes. These are data from the osteoporotic fractures in men, or the Mr. Oss study. Almost 6,000 men in the US with an average age of 74 years were followed for over 10 years, and FFQ data were collected at baseline. This figure shows fracture risk at different sites separated by quartiles of protein intake. Higher protein intake were associated with significantly lower fracture risk for major osteoporotic fracture and hip fracture. And I put red boxes around the significant results. Upon further exploration of the hip fracture results, you can see here that both dairy and non-dairy animal protein intake were significantly associated with lower hip fracture risk, whereas this was not the case for plant proteins, which showed no significant association with fracture risk. That is, it was not detrimental or beneficial. With these last two studies on this slide, I wanted to highlight the importance of the interaction between protein and calcium and D for bone mass. In this 3-year study, the effective protein intake was assessed on BMD with and without a calcium and vitamin D supplement. Participants were split by tertile for protein intake. In the figure, the black bars on the top part of the figure represent those individuals receiving the calcium and D supplement, and the bottom white bars were those receiving the placebo. Higher intakes of total protein was associated with increased total body and femoral neck BMD, but this relationship was only apparent in the group taking the calcium and vitamin D supplement. The relationship was not apparent in the group receiving the placebo. This was also somewhat the case for the UK's EPIC study. Here, fracture risk was similar for meat eaters, fish eaters, and lacto-ovo-vegetarians. For vegans, fracture risk increased, but this was only apparent in those vegans with low calcium intakes. So given the evidence, I would say that this interaction is very important for bone, and this was also importantly alluded to in the Risley consensus review that calcium levels need to be adequate in order to see the beneficial effects of greater protein intakes on bone. And I have made this point several times throughout this webinar, particularly in my discussion around the utility of dairy for bone, as dairy foods like milk contain increased levels of protein, calcium, and vitamin D together in one food. So this is the last slide of the presentation, and here are my key take-home points. Protein is indeed beneficial for bone health across the lifespan. Intakes higher than the current RDA are at least not adverse, and research shows that they are valuable in younger and older populations, particularly if calcium intakes are adequate. Perhaps intakes of around 1.2 grams per kilo per day or higher should be recommended, in quotations, because much of this research does come from studies with a muscle-centric focus, but the same sentiments, I would argue, also likely apply to bone. The food source of a protein may be important to consider. Dairy protein seems to offer more benefit. Not only do you get protein from it, but you also provide your body with the essential minerals and vitamins like calcium, vitamin D, etc., that directly work together to better our bones. Plant-based foods or diets do promote health and are promoted by our new food guide. While this is true, protein quality and nutrient density should be considered when choosing appropriate proteins to consume while keeping our bone health outcomes in mind. And this is particularly true for older adults who tend to have lower energy intakes. And for a great Canadian perspective, the recent review in APNM entitled Translating Protein Foods from the New Canada's Food Guide to Consumers, Knowledge Gaps and Recommendations is a great read. And I did provide the reference in my presentation. Not only does it discuss a variety of concepts I've touched upon today regarding protein, but it provides recommendations for how nutritional professionals, like a lot of us listening today, can educate Canadians regarding protein foods in the context of the new food guide. In relation to our bones, it also discusses how we can promote foods high in these shortfall nutrients, calcium and vitamin D, within the protein food group. So lastly, and as always, more longer-term research is needed to assess the effect of protein on bone in RCTs. Noting though, that long RCTs with harder bone endpoints are difficult to do. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Josse. That was great. So much information to think about. We will now turn to the question and answer period, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions in the allotted time as possible. So let's get started. Dr. Josse, should dietitians rely on the old food guide servings for dairy to ensure adequate calcium?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. Thank you for asking that question. And this is actually a question that I ask for my own research too. And I think generally from a practical standpoint, relying on the old food guide servings recommendations for dairy is a good idea. If you think about what the serving sizes were initially based on in the first place, particularly for dairy, they were to ensure that adequate levels of calcium, that that we achieve these adequate levels of calcium, and this relates directly to bone health. Also, the RDA for calcium hasn't changed. It's just that our food-based dietary guidelines have taken on a new form. So I do think that the old servings, particularly for milk and milk products, would help to promote adequate calcium intakes. And so I do think that they should still be implemented. We do demonstrate in the study with adolescent girls that if they consume the recommended amount, which was 3 to 4 servings of milk products per day for that age group, that they do show a greater increase in calcium, closer to the RDA, as well as protein. And this did have a beneficial effect on bone. So while technically the servings are not in play with this current food guide, I still think that it's prudent to use those serving sizes because they are based on the RDAs, and the RDAs are designed to improve our bones for calcium.
Okay, great. Next question. Should we aim for a certain amount of protein at each meal?
Yeah, this is also a really good question. And I think as a general rule, as a good rule to follow, I think having protein around 25 to 30 grams per meal would be good to implement. Now, we don't usually eat that way, unfortunately. We usually have less protein at breakfast, maybe less at lunch and more at dinner. But if we space out the protein throughout the day, it will be more beneficial because we can provide our body with a certain amount of protein that it would be able to use most effectively. So ensuring that you have a good amount of protein per meal, again, around 25 or 20 to 30 grams per meal would be a good way to go. And just as an example, 20 to 30 grams, let's say that could be around 3 ounces of cooked meat or chicken. And on the lower end, you could say that it could look like some toast with peanut butter and a glass of milk, or maybe 2 eggs and 2 slices of toast, a mixed bean salad with a drink of soy beverage on the side. So to get 20 to 30 grams, it can look, there's various ways to do that. So I think if we aim for that, then that would be ideal.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Aren't dairy products acid producing, and isn't this bad for bones?
So I did cover this in brief in the webinar, so animal products do produce some acid when they're metabolized in the body. They contain certain amino acids like cysteine that when they're broken down, they can form acid. And so these are these sulfur-containing amino acids. This is also the case for grain foods, not just dairy products. However, and as I've shown in the webinar, research shows that this is not necessarily bad for our bones. So while we do tend to see increases in urinary calcium excretion with increased protein intakes and increased animal protein, this is also accompanied by an increase in calcium absorption at the gut. So I would say there's no definitive scientific evidence that dairy products are bad for our bones, particularly from an increased acid load standpoint. In fact, I would even argue that the contrary is true, that dairy is good for our bones in many ways. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Is protein bioavailability an issue in plant-based foods?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I did allude to this a little bit in the presentation, but so it actually can be. There are particular nutrients or anti-nutrients rather in certain plant foods that can decrease our ability to absorb nutrients from within that food. So these are things like oxalates and phytates. And so they actually bind to the minerals and to the amino acids in these foods while we're digesting the actual food, and it limits our ability to absorb these nutrients. So yes, I mean, these are food matrix effects. that aren't necessarily present in animal protein foods. So one needs to just be aware that this may be the case with respect to plant-based foods. Now, there are some ways that you can mitigate the effects of these anti-nutrients and therefore improve the bioavailability of several nutrients. So for example, you can treat the plant-based foods, you can soak the legumes or the beans, you can boil the leafy greens prior to consumption, and this decreases the effect of these anti-nutrients so that you're able to get the most nutrients from these foods.
Okay, this will be our last question. Is almond beverage a good option for children and teens to choose?
So that is a really good question. And as I mentioned in the webinar, I do love almonds. I'm certainly a fan, but I would say that almond milk or almond beverage is very low in most of the important nutrients for bones, being calcium, vitamin D, and protein. So it actually does not contain a lot of these types of nutrients within the beverage. And these are very important for skeletal growth and development. So it's possible that almond beverage may be fortified with some of these nutrients, but that's not always the case. And so it is important to make sure that if you are going to consume an almond beverage, that you look at the food label. But generally speaking, I would say that particularly for children and teens to support their bone growth and bone development, that almond beverage is not necessarily a good option for those individuals to consume by virtue of the fact that it doesn't contain these important bone supporting nutrients, including protein. But I would also say to keep eating whole almonds for other great reasons, fiber, vitamin E, healthy fats, etc. But in terms of the almond beverage in particular, as an alternative to milk, it's not a good way to go.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Josse, for an informative presentation on protein for bone health and for answering so many of our questions. If you wish to send your questions directly to Dr. Josse, you can. You can reach her at ajosse, and that's AJOSSE, @yorku.ca. I will now turn things over to Isabel for concluding remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Josse, for this very informative presentation. And thanks as well to Carrie for moderating this session so effectively. Before you leave, we would greatly appreciate your feedback. So please take a few minutes to complete the survey. You may also print a certificate of attendance for your professional records. In closing, on behalf of Dairy Farmers of Canada and Osteoporosis Canada, I would like to thank you all for your participation. Thanks and goodbye.